Hello there, you're watching World News Program coming to you live from Algiers. The headlines. Bitter cold claims the lives of 2 more infants in the Gaza Strip. Authorities and humanitarian organizations warn of a sharp deterioration in humanitarian conditions, while the European Union voices serious concerns over provisions included in the Peace Council Charter. In Morocco, institutions and associations warn of a campaign targeting whistleblowers on corruption through the influence of powerful barons. Trade unions condemn the government's obstruction of social dialogue, while human rights groups denounce the growing spread of racist rhetoric against migrants. The European Union pledges to defend its interests against any external pressure. Greenland reaffirms its commitment to peaceful dialogue, while Copenhagen calls for a calm process in talks with Washington. Welcome back to the details. First, 2 Palestinian infants died on Friday after succumbing to the harsh cold sweep in the Gaza Strip. Palestinian media site and local sources reported that a 3-month-old baby died earlier in the day after being exposed to extreme cold in tents housing displaced families across the enclave. Another 6-month-old infant also died from the cold in Al-Mawasi area south of Gaza. The deaths come amid Palestinian warnings of further casualties, particularly among children and the elderly, as a severe cold wave continues to grip the territory. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs warned of further harm to Palestinian families, especially children and the elderly, as severe weather continues to hit Gaza. OCHA said recent storms damaged or destroyed shelters for around 4,000 families, further worsening the humanitarian crisis amid shortages of shelter materials and limited access to basic services. Doctors Without Borders warned of a severe deterioration in humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip amid harsh weather and ongoing Israeli attacks. In a statement issued Friday, the organization said large numbers of residents are living in temporary plastic shelters, while others remain in old tents that have been heavily damaged by strong winds and rain. Dozens of families in Khan Yunis, southern Gaza, attended the funeral of 3 journalists working with the Egyptian Committee for Gaza Relief who were killed on Wednesday in Gaza City after Zionist forces targeted a vehicle belonging to the committee. Participants chanted slogans demanding accountability for the killing of journalists, affirming that these crimes will not deter them from continuing their mission to report the truth on the ground.
يعني مسلسل الفقد مستمر من 10 عمر أكثر من 15 سنة. طبعا على صعيد العمل الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بدم بارد اغتالهم وبالتالي أعتقد أن
And European Council President Antonio Costa said EU leaders have serious reservations about several provisions of the Peace Council Charter launched by US President Donald Trump. Speaking at a press conference in Brussels on Friday, Costa said the concerns center on the Council's mandate, governance mechanisms, and its compatibility with the UN Charter.
We have serious doubts about a number of elements in the Charter of the Board of Peace related to its scope, its governance, and its compatibility with the United Nations Charter. We are ready to work together with the United States on the implementation of the comprehensive peace plan for Gaza, with a Board of Peace carrying out its mission as a transitional administration in accordance with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2803.
Amnesty International condemned the ceremony establishing the Gaza Peace Council under U.S. President Donald Trump, In a statement on X Thursday evening, the group said the event shows blatant disregard for international law and human rights, warning it escalates attacks on the UN system, global justice institutions, and internationally recognized standards. Amnesty added that it undermines decades of efforts to promote global governance, shared humanitarian values, and equality among member states. U.S. President Donald Trump announced on Friday the withdrawal of the invitation extended to Canada to join the Gaza Peace Council. In a post on Truth Social addressed to the Canadian Prime Minister, Trump said the Peace Council is withdrawing its invitation regarding Canada's membership in what he described as, I quote, the most prestigious Leaders' Council ever. A Palestinian farmer was killed after Zionist forces opened fire on him while he was working on his land near the village of Madama south of Nablus, in northern occupied West Bank. The General Authority for Civil Affairs in Nablus reported Friday that the victim, 59 years old Jabrin Ahmed Jabrqat, died from his wounds after being shot by Zionist forces, who prevented ambulance crews from reaching him and later transferred his body to an unknown location. Zionist forces opened fire on Lebanese army soldiers while they were carrying out a joint field mission with UN peacekeeping forces UNIFIL in southern Lebanon. Lebanon's national news agency reported Friday that the incident occurred near Wadi al-Safir, south of the town of Khiyam, when a tank emerged from a newly established position in Al-Hammams area and fired toward the Lebanese force. No casualties were reported. The Syrian Network for Human Rights documented the killing of at least 22 civilians and the injury of others by members of the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF) in Raqqa province on January 18. In a report published Friday on its Telegram channel, the network said the use of snipers to target individuals outside active hostilities constitutes deliberate killing of civilians, adding that targeting populated civilian areas with ground shelling and drones is prohibited under international humanitarian law. The United Nations announced it will assume responsibility for managing sprawling camps in Syria, housing tens of thousands of women and children linked to the so-called Daesh. UN spokesman Stéphane Dujarric said on Thursday evening that Al-Hol camp, along with Rouge camp, houses about 28,000 civilians, most of them women and children, who fled Daesh strongholds, and he added that UN officials have not yet been able to enter the camps due to ongoing security tensions. The European Union expressed concern over the escape from foreign Daesh fighters previously detained in Syria, confirming it is monitoring the transfer of detainees to Iraq. EU spokesman Anwar al-Anouni said Friday that recent potential escape incidents involving Daesh detainees amid clashes between the Syrian army and SDF forces are deeply concerning, adding that the EU is closely monitoring developments, including the transfer of remaining detainees to Iraq.
The recent potential escapes of ISIS detainees amidst clashes are deeply concerning. We're closely monitoring the situation, including the transfer of remaining detained fighters to Iraq, including foreign terrorist fighters.
In other news, the Moroccan Front for Supporting Palestine and Opposing Normalization has renewed its call for the release of detainees and prisoners of conscience, emphasizing that imprisonment will not silence support for Palestine. In a statement on Friday, the front condemned the authorities' ongoing normalization policies and urged Moroccans to unite against increasing Zionist influence. The Moroccan Association for the Protection of Public Funds condemned harassment of activists, blaming powerful figures linked to corruption. Its president Mohamed Al-Ghouloussi reaffirmed the group's commitment to fighting corruption and holding officials accountable, noting that this stance has put them at odds with those who quickly amassed suspicious wealth. The Moroccan Workers' Union rejected the government's technocratic approach to pension reform, condemning its suspension of social dialogue and broken commitments. The union said this has undermined the social pact, dashed workers' hopes, and worsened social tensions due to unpopular policies that overburden the working class and the wider population. The Moroccan Association for Human Rights condemned the troubling rise in racism and hate speech against Africans following the Africa Cup of Nations final. Its Rabat branch reported widespread racist and inciting rhetoric, including calls for expulsion and forced displacement, violating principles of equality and human dignity.
Racist rhetoric is no longer limited to isolated cases on social media. It has become public and recurrent in public sphere and has dangerously spread to some radio programs, reflecting an unacceptable normalization of hate speech. Continental sporting events should not be used to justify racist and exclusionary tensions, but rather to promote African solidarity and coexistence. Any official or media silence toward these practices threatens social cohesion. We strongly condemn all forms of racism, hate speech, and incitement to discrimination, and hold public authorities fully responsible for protecting individuals and responding effectively to these violations.
An article on The Atlantic affiliated with the New York Times described Western Sahara as Africa's last colony, holding Morocco's occupation and the lack of a just solution politically and legally responsible. The report criticized the international community's failure to uphold the UN-mandated self-determination referendum and highlighted serious violations by occupying authorities, including a media blackout that blocks foreign journalists and observers from reporting on the ground.
Western Sahara, Africa's last colony, has been under Moroccan occupation since Spain's withdrawal in 1975. The international community has failed to implement the UN-mandated self-determination referendum since 1991. Serious violations by the Moroccan occupation, including a media blockade preventing foreign journalists and international observers from documenting abuses, have kept the issue largely hidden from global attention. Meanwhile, Morocco exploits the territory's natural resources and expand investments while tens of thousands of Sahrawi refugees continue to live in harsh conditions in camps for nearly 5 decades.
The annual UN meeting of Secretary General Antonio Guterres with senior officials and special envoys brought the Western Sahara issue back into focus. Held in Geneva from January 18 to 20, the meetings aim to advance diplomatic efforts to resolve the decades-long colonial conflict. Participants included the Secretary General's personal envoy for Western Sahara, Staffan de Mistura, and the head of the UN mission for the referendum in Western Sahara, Alexander Ivanko, reviewing peacekeeping efforts and mediation strategies. French media, in another unjustified misstep, revived its anti-Algerian rhetoric through a so-called investigative report, lacking professionalism and turning public media into a platform for anti-Algerian agendas in early election campaigns. Hossam Barkan has more.
Algeria-phobia is no longer just a political tool or an election tactic. It has become a systemic agenda adopted by French media across the board. This latest scandal came from French public television, specifically France Tier, which turned a TV program into a platform for terrorists, fugitives, and even spies under the guise of diplomacy, leaving no effort spared to disparage Algeria in every possible way. The hostile turn of French media toward Algeria did not stop at lies dressed as investigation. It also gave free rein to guests to breach the most basic ethical and professional standards, aligning fully with the most extreme and rodent far-right ideologies.
Franchement, c'est qu'avec la poussée en France de l'extrême droite qui est très...
Frankly, the reason is the rise of the far right in France, which still wields significant influence. Everything achieved is at risk of being undone. What worries me is that tomorrow, the new political forces likely to take power may renounce all these measures, because the far right still holds substantial sway. We see this in the polls, and it is an extremely serious cause for concern.
Hatred of Algeria has become a political race. The French right and other politicians have made anti-Algerian sentiment their signature, turning it into cheap ideological commerce. French public television, funded by the taxes of ordinary French citizens, now competes with extremist media networks for this narrative.
The government is supported by a handful of oligarchs, so it's natural that they have influence. The only certainty I have today is that they make a lot of noise, and the far right is very organized in creating noise. Noise on social media, media noise, and most importantly, they have maintained their economic influence through a pluralistic oligarchy investing in the media.
The fall did not stop at false reporting. In the so-called investigation, guests were even more disgraceful. A fake French diplomat obsessed with the Algeria syndrome, a drug dealer, and a blackmailer, all protected by French authorities, presented as essential experts in anti-Algerian propaganda. France's hostile discourse has become a commodity in an open Parisian auction, where political factions that reject parity compete. Algerian sovereignty remains non-negotiable.
And Algeria is set to launch a massive 1,600-kilometer railway linking the Garaj-Bilat mine to northern industrial zones and ports, signaling a bold shift in its economy or economic strategy. Mohammed Khatil reports.
To bolster its economic development and diversify its income sources, Algeria is launching one of the largest strategic projects in its history. The railway linking Oran in the north to Garaj-Bilat in the south, passing through Bashar and Tindouf. This vital project, stretching over 1,600 kilometers, aims to connect the Garaj-Bilat iron ore mine, one of the world's largest, with a huge reserve estimated at over 3.5 billion tons of iron ore, to the industrial zones and ports in the north of the country.
This allows Algeria to connect with the southwest regions in particular and exploit the great potential it possesses there. This is an important project for Algeria as a whole and for the region in particular. From an economic perspective, it reduces the cost as a single train journey replaces more than 50 large trucks that transport large quantities. This reduces costs and preserves the road network. Furthermore, it increases the speed of transportation. This railway line can reduce travel time to less than 2 days or maximum 2 days.
يمكن تخفيض المدة إلى أقل من يومين أو على أقصى تقدير يومين.
This strategic project represents a fundamental pillar for exploiting mineral resources and allows for the transport of millions of tons of iron ore annually, with a significant reduction in transportation costs and direct support for processing industries, especially the iron and steel industry, and the creation of thousands of jobs. It will also contribute to supporting regional integration and strengthens Algeria's position as a gateway to Africa.
It
also paves the way for Algeria to potentially become a hub for exporting this material. In other words, it becomes a logistics center from the south to the north. This is very important because it serves as a gateway to transporting these raw materials to these countries. The more infrastructure is developed, the more commercial partnerships with these countries.
The implementation of the Oran-Bashar-Garaj-Bilat railway project will highly contribute to the country's economy, which aims to make the mining sector one of the most important contributors to Algeria's GDP.
European Council President Antonio Costa affirmed the EU's determination to defend itself against external pressure. Following an emergency summit on relations with the US and Washington's Greenland threats, he said the EU will protect its interests, member states, citizens and companies, stressing that it has the tools and will use them when needed.
The goal remains the effective stabilization of the trade relations between the European Union and the United States. At the same time, the European Union will continue to stand up for its interests and will defend itself, its member states, its citizens and its companies against any form of coercion. And it has the power and the tools to do so, and will do so if and when necessary.
Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen arrived in Nuuk, Greenland, on Friday to meet the local government leader, according to AFP. Before the visit, she met NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in Brussels, where they agreed on the need to strengthen NATO's Arctic presence. The trip follows a 2-week-old crisis that united Europe against US President Donald Trump, who ultimately abandoned threats to seize Greenland militarily or impose tariffs. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen called for a calm approach in upcoming talks with the US on Greenland. On Friday, he said Danish and American diplomats met in Washington on Thursday to outline a roadmap for progress, adding that Denmark will not reveal dates for future meetings.
We're not going to communicate when those meetings are, because what's needed now is to take the drama out of this. We need to get away from the fact that every time someone says something, we have to comment on it and escalate the situation. Now we need to have a calm process.
And Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Ukrainian forces must withdraw from Donbass for a settlement, calling it essential for Russia. He added that the region has suffered heavy damage, suggested using frozen Russian assets in the US to rebuild affected areas.
First, we naturally don't want to publicly go into the details of the provisions being discussed. Therefore, I cannot and will not tell you what exactly is meant by the Anchorage formula. We believe this would be inappropriate. Russia's position is well known. Ukraine and its armed forces must leave the territory of Donbass and be withdrawn from there. This is a very important condition. There are also other nuances that remain on the negotiating agenda.
And the German government expressed doubts about Russia's willingness to make concessions to resolve the conflict in Ukraine during anticipated talks involving Russian, Ukrainian and US officials. German government spokesman Stefan Meyer said at a regular press conference in Berlin on Friday that serious questions remain about whether Russia is prepared to abandon its maximalist demands.
We know that there are important questions about the extent to which Russia is willing to give up its maximalist demands. Nothing will be achieved if the peace agreement ultimately means just a reprieve for Russia, which can then launch new attacks. Any agreement must establish lasting peace, and the West must provide security guarantees to Ukraine.
US President Donald Trump said a US naval fleet is heading toward Iran, warning Tehran against killing protesters or restarting its nuclear program. Speaking aboard Air Force One returning from Davos, he called the deployment a precaution and threatened a stronger strike if Iran executes protesters.
And we'll see what happens. You know, we have a lot of ships going that direction, just in case. We have a big flotilla going in that direction. And we'll see what happens. Big force. We have a big force going toward Iran. I'd rather not see anything happen, but we're watching them very closely. I stopped 837 hangings on Thursday. They would have been dead. Every one of them would have been hung. This is like from 1,000 years ago. This is an ancient culture.
And lastly, the United States has officially completed its withdrawal from the World Health Organization. In a statement, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services announced the end of the United States 78-year membership in the WHO, 1 year after President Donald Trump's decision to withdraw, noting that all U.S. funding to the organization has been cut and all U.S. personnel recalled.
Funding of the World Health Organization while a review is conducted to...
The end of our program for tonight. Thank you for watching. Thanks for your kind attention. If you missed any part, you can find it on our social media platforms. Take care.